Spiritual awakening isn't the blissful Instagram fantasy you've been sold. In fact, it can feel like your entire reality is burning to the ground while you're still living in it. Behind every glowing testimonial lies a darkness so profound it'll make you question whether you've lost your mind or found your soul. Look, I know this isn't what you want to hear. You've probably been fed the same spiritual fairy tale we all have. Meditate enough, raise your vibration, and suddenly you'll be floating on cloud nine with unlimited abundance and inner peace. But here's the brutal truth nobody's talking about. Real spiritual awakening is more like having your psychological house burned down while you're still living in it. And today, I'm going to walk you through the dark corridors of awakening that the spiritual community desperately wants to keep hidden. Because if you're on this path, or thinking about starting it, you need to know what you're really signing up for. The illusion of blissful awakening. Let's start with the biggest lie in the spiritual world, that awakening is supposed to feel good. Every spiritual influencer, every meditation app, every new age book sells you the same fantasy. They paint pictures of eternal bliss, constant joy, and unshakable inner peace. They show you images of people sitting in lotus position with serene smiles, as if they've discovered some cosmic cheat code to happiness. But here's what they don't tell you, that Instagram-worthy moment of enlightenment? It's maybe 5% of the actual experience. The other 95% feels like you're being psychologically dismantled by an invisible force you can't control or understand. Think about it this way. You've spent your entire life building an identity, constructing beliefs about who you are, what matters, how the world works. You've created elaborate defense mechanisms, coping strategies, and comfortable illusions that help you navigate daily life. Then spiritual awakening shows up like a cosmic wrecking ball and starts demolishing everything you thought you knew about yourself and reality. The spiritual community calls this ego death, and they make it sound like shedding an old coat. But imagine if someone told you that to become who you're meant to be, you first need to watch everything you believe about yourself crumble into dust. Would you sign up for that? Probably not. So they dress it up in pretty language and sell it as transformation. Here's what ego death actually feels like. One day you wake up and the person you've been your entire life feels like a stranger. The goals that used to motivate you seem pointless. The relationships that once brought you joy feel hollow and fake. The career you worked years to build feels like playing dress-up in someone else's life. You look in the mirror and think, who is this person, and what have they been doing with my life? This isn't depression, though it can feel similar. This is your consciousness expanding beyond the narrow confines of your previous identity, and it's terrifying. Because if you're not who you thought you were, then who are you? And if nothing you believed about reality is true, then what is real? And that's just the beginning. Because once your old self dies, something even harder begins. The loneliness that nobody warns you about. But the identity crisis is just the beginning. What comes next is a loneliness so profound it can make you question whether human connection is even possible anymore. And here's why. As you start seeing through the illusions that most people live by, you realize you can't go back to the conversations, relationships, and activities that used to fill your social life. Picture this scenario. You're at a dinner party with friends you've known for years. They're complaining about their jobs, gossiping about mutual acquaintances, discussing their latest purchases or vacation plans. 6 months ago, you would have jumped right into these conversations. But now you see these discussions as distractions from deeper truths. You watch your friends getting worked up about things that, from your new perspective, seem trivial or illusory. You want to connect, but how do you bridge the gap between where you are and where they are? How do you explain that their problems, while real to them, are symptoms of a deeper spiritual sleep? How do you share your insights without sounding preachy, crazy, or condescending? So you start withdrawing. Not because you don't love these people, but because the conversations feel increasingly hollow. You find yourself smiling and nodding, while internally feeling like an alien observer studying human behavior. The jokes don't seem funny anymore. The dramas don't seem important anymore. The concerns that animate most people's lives feel like elaborate distractions from what really matters. This creates what I call the awakening paradox. The more conscious you become, the less you seem to fit into the unconscious world around you. You're gaining a deeper understanding of life, but losing your ability to relate to most people living it. And here's the cruel twist. Just when you need support the most, just when you're going through the most disorienting transformation of your life, you find yourself increasingly isolated. Your old friends don't understand what you're going through. Your family thinks you've joined a cult or lost your mind. And finding new people who are on a similar path? That's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. The spiritual community will tell you to find your tribe, but they don't mention how hard it is to find authentic spiritual seekers who aren't just collecting experiences or using spirituality as another form of ego enhancement. Most spiritual communities are filled with people who are either beginners asking the same basic questions you've moved beyond, or advanced practitioners who seem to have forgotten what it's like to be in the messy middle of transformation. But if you think isolation is tough, wait until your emotions start going haywire. The breakdown before the breakthrough. Now, let's talk about what happens when the real work begins. Because once you've lost your old identity and found yourself spiritually homeless, the universe decides it's time for some intensive healing. And by healing, I mean dragging every suppressed emotion, every unprocessed trauma, every shadow aspect of your personality into the harsh light of consciousness. This is what spiritual teachers poetically call purification, but it feels more like psychological warfare. Suddenly, emotions you thought you dealt with years ago come flooding back with tsunami-like intensity. Childhood traumas you'd buried resurface with crystal clarity. Patterns of behavior you'd never noticed become glaringly obvious and impossible to ignore. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like in practice. You might find yourself crying uncontrollably over seemingly small triggers. A commercial on TV about fathers and daughters sends you into a sobbing fit about your relationship with your dad. A friend's casual comment about your appearance triggers a cascade of shame about body image issues you thought you'd resolved. A song on the radio unlocks a grief so deep you feel like you're drowning in it. Your emotional regulation, which you've spent decades perfecting, completely falls apart. You're either numb and disconnected, or overwhelmed by feelings so intense they knock you off your feet. There's no middle ground, no emotional stability. You feel like you're going crazy, but you're actually going sane. You're finally feeling all the emotions you've been suppressing to function in a dysfunctional world. The really challenging part is that nobody in your life understands why you're suddenly so sensitive or emotional. They see you as falling apart, and in a way, you are. But you're falling apart because you're finally strong enough to feel what you've been avoiding. You're breaking down because you're finally ready to break through. But try explaining that to your boss when you have a panic attack in the middle of a meeting. Try explaining that to your spouse when you suddenly can't handle the emotional dynamics of your relationship. Try explaining that to yourself when you're lying on your bathroom floor at 3 a.m, sobbing for reasons you can't articulate. This is when many people abandon the spiritual path. They decide the cost is too high, the process too painful. They try to stuff the emotions back down, rebuild their old identity, and return to their previous level of consciousness. But here's the thing about awakening. Once it starts, there's no going back. You can resist it, and just when you think you've survived the emotional tsunami, reality itself starts to unravel which makes it more painful, but you can't undo it. When your world no longer makes sense, as if emotional chaos wasn't enough, awakening also dismantles your understanding of how reality works. Everything you learned in school, everything your culture taught you about success and happiness, Everything you believed about how life works, it all starts to crumble. You begin to see that most of what we call normal is actually a collective agreement to ignore deeper truths about existence. The 9-to-5 routine that structures most people's lives starts to feel like a prison. The consumer culture that promises happiness through acquisition reveals itself as a hamster wheel of never-ending desire. The social hierarchies that determine who's important and who's not seem arbitrary and meaningless. But here's the kicker. You still have to live in this world. You still need money to pay rent. You still have to interact with institutions and systems that feel increasingly absurd. You still need to function in a society whose values you're beginning to question at a fundamental level. This creates a daily experience of cognitive dissonance that can be maddening. Part of you sees through the illusions that keep society running, while another part of you has to participate in those same illusions to survive. You feel like you're acting in a play you no longer believe in, speaking lines that feel false, playing a character that isn't really you. Work becomes particularly challenging during this phase. How do you stay motivated in a job that feels meaningless when you're starting to understand what really matters in life? How do you play corporate politics when you can see how petty and ego-driven most workplace dynamics are? How do you care about quarterly earnings or performance reviews when you're grappling with questions about the nature of consciousness and reality? Many people going through awakening find themselves unable to function in their careers the way they used to. They lose motivation, struggle with focus, or find themselves in constant conflict with workplace cultures that suddenly seem toxic or pointless. Some quit their jobs impulsively, others get fired for poor performance, and many just go through the motions while feeling dead inside. The same thing happens with other life structures. Romantic relationships that once felt satisfying start to feel limiting if your partner isn't growing at the same pace. Friendships that were based on shared complaints or shallow activities lose their appeal. Even family relationships can become strained as you change in ways that make others uncomfortable. But here's where things get really twisted. Just when you need support most, your spiritual progress becomes your biggest obstacle. The spiritual ego trap. Just when you think you're making progress on your awakening journey, the spiritual ego shows up to complicate things even further. This is perhaps the most insidious aspect of the dark side of awakening, because it disguises itself as growth, while actually reinforcing the very patterns you're trying to transcend. The spiritual ego is what happens when your regular ego adapts to spiritual concepts and uses them as new forms of superiority and identity. Instead of being proud of your job title or your possessions, you become proud of your spiritual insights. Instead of judging others for their lack of success or sophistication, you judge them for their lack of consciousness or awareness. Here's how this shows up in real life. You start to feel special because you can see things other people can't. You develop a subtle sense of superiority over people who are still asleep or unconscious. You use spiritual language to avoid taking responsibility for your problems. Instead of admitting you're angry, you say you're processing dense energy. Instead of acknowledging your judgments, you claim you're holding space for others' growth. The spiritual ego loves to collect experiences and insights like trophies. You become attached to having powerful meditations, meaningful synchronicities, or profound realizations. You start measuring your spiritual progress like you might measure career advancement, constantly comparing yourself to others and trying to accumulate more advanced practices or deeper insights. This is where the spiritual community can become particularly toxic. People compete over who's more enlightened, who has the better teacher, who's doing the more advanced practices. They use spiritual concepts as weapons to shame others or as shields to avoid criticism. They create hierarchies based on supposed levels of consciousness, with everyone trying to prove they're higher up the ladder than everyone else. The really tricky part is that the spiritual ego can maintain itself for years, even decades, without you realizing it's there. You can be doing all the right practices, saying all the right things, and having genuine spiritual experiences, while still being fundamentally driven by the same ego patterns you started with. The only difference is that now those patterns are dressed up in spiritual clothing. This is why so many spiritual teachers and longtime practitioners can be just as dysfunctional in their relationships and behavior as anyone else, despite having spent decades on the path. They've never actually transcended their ego. They've just given it a spiritual makeover. And even if you spot these traps, you're still facing the hardest challenge of all. The integration challenge. Even if you successfully navigate the emotional breakdowns, the reality shifts, and the ego traps, you still face the massive challenge of integration. This is where you have to figure out how to live as a more conscious person in an unconscious world, how to maintain your insights while still functioning in practical reality. Integration is like trying to translate a foreign language that doesn't have equivalent words in your native tongue. You've had experiences and realizations that can't be communicated to most people. You've seen aspects of reality that have no place in ordinary conversation. You've felt levels of love, unity, and understanding that seem to have no practical application in daily life. So how do you live with this knowledge? How do you go to the grocery store, pay your bills, and make small talk with neighbors when you've experienced the interconnectedness of all existence? How do you care about career advancement when you've felt your essential nature beyond all roles and identities? How do you get excited about weekend plans when you've touched something timeless and eternal? Many people get stuck in what I call integration purgatory. They're too conscious to fully engage with ordinary life, but not integrated enough to transcend it. They feel like they're floating between two worlds without fully belonging to either one. This often leads to a kind of spiritual bypassing, where people use their spiritual insights to avoid dealing with practical responsibilities. They might quit their jobs without having a plan because the universe will provide. They might end relationships impulsively because their partner isn't spiritually aligned. They might neglect their health, finances, or family responsibilities because these things seem less important than their inner work. But true integration requires the opposite. It requires you to bring your expanded consciousness into engagement with the world, not to escape from it. It requires you to find ways to honor both your spiritual insights and your human responsibilities. It requires you to be fully awakened and fully functional at the same time. But wait, there's another cruel twist nobody mentions. The never-ending process. Here's another aspect of awakening that nobody prepares you for. It never ends. There's no graduation ceremony, no moment when you can say, okay, I'm fully awakened now. There's always another layer to uncover, another pattern to release, another level of consciousness to explore. This can be incredibly frustrating, especially when you've been on the path for years and feel like you should be done by now. You keep expecting to reach some state of permanent enlightenment where life becomes effortless and blissful. But instead, you discover that awakening is more like an infinite spiral staircase. You're always moving upward, but you never reach the top. Each level of consciousness brings new challenges and new opportunities for growth. Just when you think you've mastered non-attachment, life presents you with situations that test your equanimity in new ways. Just when you think you've transcended fear, deeper layers of fear reveal themselves. Just when you think you've learned to love unconditionally, relationships show you where your love still has conditions. This can lead to a kind of spiritual exhaustion, where you get tired of constantly working on yourself, constantly growing, constantly being challenged to evolve. You want to just be normal for a while, to have simple pleasures and uncomplicated relationships. But consciousness doesn't work that way. Once it starts expanding, it has its own momentum. The never-ending nature of awakening also means you have to find ways to appreciate the journey itself, rather than constantly striving for some imaginary destination. You have to learn to find fulfillment in the process of growth, rather than in achieving some final state of perfection. So after all this darkness, why would anyone choose this path? Here's what they don't tell you. The gifts hidden in the darkness. Now, After painting this picture of awakening's dark side, you might be wondering why anyone would choose this path. And the truth is, most people don't choose it, it chooses them. But despite all the challenges I've described, there are gifts hidden within the darkness that make the journey worthwhile. The first gift is authenticity. When you can no longer hide behind false personas and social masks, you discover who you really are beneath all the conditioning. This authentic self is more creative, more loving, more alive than anything you've experienced before. Yes, the process of stripping away the false self is painful, but what emerges is infinitely more beautiful. The second gift is genuine compassion. When you've been through your own dark night of the soul, you develop a deep empathy for others who are suffering. You can't judge people for their struggles when you know how hard it is to be human. This compassion isn't the sentimental kind based on pity. It's the fierce kind based on recognition. The third gift is freedom from fear. Not because you never feel afraid, but because you've learned that you can survive any experience, including the death of everything you thought you were. This kind of fearlessness allows you to take risks, speak truth, and love deeply in ways that weren't possible when you were protecting a fragile sense of self. The fourth gift is presence. When you've lost your investment in past and future stories, you naturally settle into the present moment. And in the present moment, life is actually quite simple and often beautiful, even when it's challenging. The fifth gift is meaning. Not the kind of meaning that comes from external achievements or recognition, but the kind that comes from aligning with something greater than your personal agenda. When you've touched the sacred dimension of existence, ordinary life becomes infused with purpose. The wisdom of the dark path, the spiritual community, needs to start being more honest about what awakening actually entails. We need to stop selling it as a quick fix for life's problems and start acknowledging it as the profound, challenging, transformative process it really is. This doesn't mean we should scare people away from the spiritual path. It means we should prepare them for it. We should teach people that the dark phases aren't signs they're doing something wrong, but signs they're finally doing something right. We should help them understand that breakdown is often breakthrough in disguise. We should also teach people that awakening isn't about becoming someone new. It's about discovering who you've always been beneath all the layers of conditioning. The person you're seeking is already there, waiting to be uncovered. But uncovering them requires removing everything that isn't them, and that process can feel like dying. Most importantly, we should teach people that they don't have to walk this path alone. While awakening can be isolating, it doesn't have to be solitary. Finding even one person who understands what you're going through can make all the difference. Having a teacher, therapist, or community that can normalize the process can prevent you from thinking you're losing your mind when you're actually finding your soul. Living the questions. As I wrap up this exploration of awakening's shadow side, I want to leave you with something important. You don't need to have all the answers. In fact, part of awakening is learning to live comfortably with questions that don't have neat solutions. The spiritual path isn't about figuring everything out. It's about learning to dance with mystery. It's about developing the courage to not know, the wisdom to stay curious, and the faith to keep moving forward even when you can't see the destination. If you're in the middle of a dark phase of your own awakening, know that what you're experiencing is normal and necessary. Your confusion is not a sign of failure. It's a sign of growth. Your emotional intensity isn't pathology. It's healing in motion. Your inability to relate to your old life isn't loss. It's evolution. And if you're thinking about beginning a spiritual path, now you know what you're really signing up for. This isn't a casual hobby or a feel-good lifestyle choice. This is a complete transformation of your understanding of yourself and reality. It will challenge everything you believe, change everything you value, and ask everything of you. But here's the thing. The alternative is staying asleep. And once you've glimpsed what's possible for human consciousness, once you've felt the love and freedom that lie beyond the ego's defenses, going back to sleep isn't really an option. You might try to resist the awakening process, but you can't unknow what you've learned or unfeel what you've felt. So if you're on this path, be gentle with yourself. Allow the process to unfold at its own pace. Trust that the breakdown is leading to breakthrough, even when you can't see how. Remember that every person who has ever awakened has walked through the same darkness you're experiencing. You're not alone, you're not crazy, and you're not broken. You're becoming who you've always been meant to be. The dark side of awakening isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. It's the necessary crucible that burns away everything false so that everything true can emerge. And while the journey through that darkness can be the most challenging thing you'll ever experience, it's also the most worthwhile. Because on the other side of that darkness isn't just personal enlightenment. It's the possibility of becoming a fully conscious human being, capable of loving without conditions, living without fear, and contributing to the awakening of our entire species. And that possibility, that potential, makes every moment of the journey worthwhile. The path isn't easy, but it's real. The destination isn't guaranteed, but the journey itself transforms you. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. If this resonated with your own awakening experience, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear they're not alone on this path.